Welcome once again to the Ace Podcast with me, Pete Paphides. I'm delighted to have with me a writer who, since the publication of his pioneering punk history, England's Dreaming, has created a unique place for himself as a peerless assimilator of musical and social history. Other titles bearing his name include The Faber Book of Pop, which he edited with Hanif Qureshi, Teenage, The Prehistory of Youth Culture, and a book of interviews undertaken for England's Dreaming, the England's Dreaming tapes. His enthusiasm for the music he writes about is abundant to anyone who's read his work or heard him speak or indeed listened to the many fantastic compilations he's put together over the years. Among them, Queer Noises 1961 to 1978, Fame, which was a secret history of post-punk 78 to 81. He was also responsible for compiling a secret history of second-wave psychedelia 1988 to 1993, Intense Tamla, Meridian 70, and Black Hole Californian post-punk 1977 to 1980. I mentioned his enthusiasm, and some writers use enthusiasm to fill the void where research and corroboration might have actually served them better. However, that's not the way of this gentleman. One of the absolute joys of his most recent book, 1966, a month-by-month examination of what happened to music in that very year, was the astute referencing of contemporaneous sources from California beat boom journal KRLA Beat to 1966 Boyfriend Book. Better still, you could read it all while listening to the Ace compilation that he put together as a sonic complement to the book. Now he's set his sights on the following year, which in many ways was a radically different proposition to the preceding 12 months. The new compilation he's put together for Ace is called 1967, The Year Pop Divided. We'll come on to that, well, in a matter of seconds, I suspect. But right now, let's extend a warm welcome to Mr. Jon Savage. Hello, John.
Hello, Peter.
How are you?
I'm fine, except the roads are all up round here.
So you look placid on the face of it, but I suspect that mentally you're paddling furiously.
No, it's okay. It's just I don't live in London anymore, so getting involved in London traffic jams is a bit stressful.
So you're in Anglesey.
I live in Anglesey. Yeah.
And how long have you been there?
Full time, 19 years.
Right. Okay. And what precipitated that move?
Space really, and also being able to sell, sorry, property alert here, being able to sell a noisy 2-bedroom flat and get a really nice place to live in North Wales, right by the sea.
And I'm guessing that maybe part of the reason why you needed more space is because you keep all this archive of pop culture material. Is that right?
Yes, Pete. Well, I regard my archives as a bad idea, which is hoarding pushed through my mania into a good idea, which means that all the hoarding turns into an archive, which means that I can sell it, and which I do.
You do?
Yeah.
Oh, okay. That must mean that there are times when you regret having sold certain things.
No, because it's part of the I've got, for instance, I've got a record mirror in front of me here, which I love. It's a pop paper I love. It's got Tony Hall and great singles reviews, and I've got a whole run of them between 65 and 68, every single one. And when the time comes to sell them, which I hope is very soon, I won't regret it for an instant, because the shutter goes down. Once the decision is made, that's it.
Drop me a line when you start to think about selling it, John. I think I might be interested. You've put together this compilation of 1967 music. Does this mean you've started working on a book about 1967?
No, it's in a way it's in lieu. Obviously, I've actually just been taking a break. I've been working non-stop for about 30 years on various books and various films. And I'm certainly not doing a book about 1967, which is a shame. But number one, I don't like repeating myself, so it would have been a bit obvious to do 67 for me after 66. So the next big book I do will be something completely different. I didn't want to start another big book so soon after the last one. And when I mean a big book, I mean a big book. I think the original. I think I wrote nearly 300,000 words on 1966, and then I had to cut it down by a third. So it's a lot of work, and I'm taking a break from that at the minute. So the quick answer is no.
I mean, you say you know you don't like repeating yourself, but in a way, one thing that strikes me about 1967, the year in music, I think it is a very different year to 1966. Do you agree with that, or?
Yeah, the big difference is in black music you're starting to move out of soul into funk, and in white pop and the start of rock music you have psychedelia, which you don't have so overtly in 66. You have the start of psychedelia in 66, but in 67 LSD is a big thing. And I mean, there's several tracks on the comp that actually either enshrine LSD as a great thing to do, like Levitation by the 13th Floor Elevators, who recorded on LSD, or records that think that maybe it wasn't such a good idea, like Believe It or Not by Rex Garvin and the Mighty Craviers, or even The Shag and Stop and Listen, which is a wonderful song, which is all about a guy, the singer, all his friends are telling him it's really great to take LSD, and he's thinking, maybe I'll leave it.
I guess it's one way to sort of, to address the zeitgeist without necessarily, hurling yourself into a risky situation. I'm glad you mentioned both those records, and I'd like to focus momentarily on Rex Garvin and the Mighty Cravers. Rex Garvin strikes me as a kind of an opportunist character, because he also did Sock It To Him JB, which was the JB in question in this case was James Bond.
Yes, yeah. You'd think it's James Brown, but in fact the track, you get them yelling out "Casino Royal" and all this kind of stuff in the middle of it. And on the B side, in fact, it was on the previous comp. It was on the 66 comp, and the flip side, part 2, is basically a dub track. They've stripped out all the instruments and just leave the rhythm, which is sort of incredible. And this, I don't actually know much about him, but this one is just so great because it's sort of vaguely trippy, the music, but I think it begins with a gong. But, he's saying, don't take it, it's really a bad idea. You're going to see vampires.
Did you? I saw a quote a while ago, actually, because I was digging around when I played Sock It To Him JB on my radio show for Soho Radio. I wanted to find out a bit about him, and he was asked about he was asked about Believe It or Not, and he said that was just the craze in the early 60s, so I wrote a song about it. I never tried it. I never wanted to try it. You see, a lot of people when you're on tour want you to try things. I was scared to try it. I remember a guy who told me he tried that shit and woke up in a gigantic vagina. I didn't want to feel that shit.
Yeah, well, okay, some people do have psychosexual problems, Pete. But, well, LSD, well, it's very, very strong stuff. I wouldn't recommend that anybody took it. And also, LSD was very much seen as a white person's thing until really maybe even 68, 69, when you started to get proper psychedelic soul and funk. That didn't happen for a bit. And initially, I got a copy of Sepia magazine from the end of 66, where LSD is a nightmare drug and white people take it, don't you take it? So it was very much a white thing initially.
Why do you think that is? Do you think there's a kind of decadence involved in wanting to sort of escape your middle-class, comfortable existence, or is it just quite purely just the way it entered culture?
I think it's the way it entered culture. I think that whatever one would like to think, and there was a lot of musical crossover at the time, the two worlds were very, very separate and becoming increasingly more separate. In fact, of course, 1967 is the year of riots and Newark, and the Black Panthers are really getting going. So it's the start of that division, increased division really between the races, which really, unfortunately, kicks off in 68 with the assassination of Martin Luther King. And so people say, like Stax Records, which is an integrated oasis in the middle of segregation, even that starts to divide and get segregated and separated in 68. Right. So you start to have, and there is this moment in the mid-60s when Bob Dylan is influencing Holland Dozier Holland, and Solomon Burke is covering A Maggie's Farm, and Otis Redding is covering Day Tripper and Aretha's covering Satisfaction. So you do get this crossover, but that doesn't seem to last for very long. And you get the idea of Black Power and Say It Out Loud, I'm Black and I'm Proud in '68. So this is kind of the last year when it really happens. And you do have, of course, a wonderful psychedelic record with Reflections by Diana Ross and the Supremes.
Absolutely. Do you not think that I felt like maybe, and defer to you because your knowledge is quite vastly greater than mine. I felt like that traffic between soul and rock sort of continued into the early '70s a little bit when you had that sort of Edwin Starr and things like You Need Love Like I Do,
yes,
Gladys Knight. And that it seemed to fall away quite sharply after that.
Yes.
I felt like it was kind of hovering for a while.
Well, of course, and also as you get into the '70s, it's a golden age of Black American music, and it's not a golden age for rock music, although some people are trying to reclaim it. Let me tell you, I was 18 in 1971, and if you wanted to rock, it wasn't happening. That's why everybody goes on about the Flaming Groovies and the MC5, not because they're super brilliant, although I love them to bits. It's just they rocked, and nobody else was rocking.
Yeah.
And I really do like rock music to be fast.
Absolutely, yeah. I mean, it just fell apart, didn't it? I mean, there was just this moment and actually, though you kind of, another one of your compilations, Meridian 70, kind of captures that time of uncertainty very well.
Yes. Well, I mean, the idea of that was, of course, whatever we say now, me and my friends were listening to, I don't know, the latest Dreadful Birds album in 1971 or 1970. And we were listening to all the solo albums by '60s psychedelic groups. And there was always one really good track on the album. I mean, they were notorious, those records. They had one or two great tracks and the rest was just filler or garbage. And so the idea was just to fillet those great tracks and put them on one compilation. And it's a lot of fun. I do like music from that period, but, it's my real love is for rock music to be loud and fast. I know a lot of people are reclaiming that period, and it's great. Bob Stanley's just done a really good compilation on it, and I respect it and I enjoy listening to it, but it wasn't where my heart lay at the time. And
you really do, as you said, you really do have to seek out those tracks because they're not abundant on albums. They just happen occasionally. You mentioned the Byrds earlier on, and one thing I love about this compilation, the 1967, it's a thing that actually I rather like to do when I'm compiling, putting together compilations for people, is to put stuff that people know as well as stuff that people don't know, because I don't want it to be a bit too much like having to eat your greens,
Well, and also there's a lot of compilations which has alternate takes and stuff, and although I think it's interesting, it's not necessarily something you want to play all the way through. And this was very much, the idea of this was very much an enhanced simulation of me listening to Radio Caroline South in 1967. Yeah. So there's a lot of records that I actually heard on the radio at that time because I was 13 and I made lists, as one does. And then there's other stuff like, 13th Floor Elevators or the Third Bardo or maybe one of the, So Sharp, that I wouldn't have heard them, but I really like and I put in anyway. But a lot of these tracks, like At the Third, particularly more obscure ones, like Piccadilly Line, At the Third Stroke, Lazy Life by William E., The Idol by the Fortunes, a lot of the kind of, I wanted to put mainstream-ish pop on there. Not that they were successful, but they were sort of mainstream-ish pop records that were made in the style of the time. And what I like about the style of the time, of course, is that it was psychedelic and it was free and easy. And so you get a lot of strings and you get harpsichords and you get a free and easy feel and you get a bit of weird sound effects and all that sort of stuff on top of a basic pop record. So it's great.
This is kind of where pop and rock were starting to separate in earnest, isn't it?
Yes. I mean, I just going back to, I really, really like all the psychedelic stuff. I love backwards tapes. I love sitars. I love strings. I love exotic instrumentation. And it's one thing I've always hated about the band is that they came along the next year and say, we aim to get rid of all that psychedelic shit. Well, actually, I really like all that psychedelic. And I think the band are really dreary. So you can shut up. Oh God, that first album. I know I do like bits of the band later on, but they start with Tears of Rage and it goes on forever, and you just want to die.
The band, it's amazing though, isn't it? Because the band are like, the band almost remind me of what's happening these days with austerity. It's just this kind of very self-conscious, almost self-punishing paring back of our embarrassing daydreaming excesses of before.
Yes. It's boring. And also they have beards.
They have beards.
Beards and pop music do not mix. If somebody's got beards, they don't make great pop music, except for the Beatles in early 67.
Okay.
Test this one. Road test this one.
You're going
out.
far too quickly for me to verify or refute
road test that one out, Peter. Except for ABBA, and of course I don't really like ABBA, so there you are.
Don't you?
They were the enemy, Peter, back in 1977. I was a punk rocker. I didn't like ABBA. I thought they were awful.
Do you feel that you have to indefinitely exercise fidelity to?
No, but it does influence thinking. I mean, I do actually like Dancing Queen, and I do actually like, what's the other one I like of theirs? The Visitors, which is kind of great. But, the lingering prejudices remain. And that's fun, because in the end, all you're doing is blathering about pop music, and people can agree or disagree, and you can have a nice argument about it. And I love arguing about pop music. It doesn't mean I'm right, but I love it all, and I'm very amused. I always love it when people try. I've had people try and say to me, "Well, look, John, I think you're being a bit snobby about Engelbert Humperdinck." Engelbert Humperdinck, that record made me want to die when I heard it in 1967. Do you think I'm going to be nice about it now? Please release me.
I don't think has anyone tried to release me? I'd be surprised if they have.
I think they'd like to try, and I'm not having it for an instant. But no, of course I don't. And actually, it's quite interesting to examine your prejudices. I do that by watching the Top of the Pops 1970s. And it was interesting, I watched the 1976 ones, and there were the 4 records that drove me screaming into the arms of punk, which were Fernando by ABBA, which is my anti-ABBA thing, and Save Your Kisses for Me, obviously, by Brotherhood of Man. I've got a brand new Combine Harvester by Edge Cutler, and Elton and Kiki, Don't Go Breaking My Heart, and I just hated those records with a rare passion.
Well, that's symptomatic of obviously how old where you were at that point in your life.
But also, pop music wasn't doing what pop music ideally should have done, and a lot of what happened in punk is a lot of people were very, very. They'd been to the 60s, they'd expected a vital and fascinating pop culture, and they got Edge Cutler. So everybody was a bit fed up and disappointed.
Edge Cutler was, even at 6, I don't think I like the Wurzels, but Edge Cutler's got the worst. It's the argument at its worst, isn't it? Whereas
there was a sense, if you look at Top of the Pops in 1976, there's a lot of drag and there's a lot of patronising DJs, and everybody says about punk, it's prog rock, and whether anybody's right or wrong, this is how people felt at the time. A lot of prog rock. It wasn't prog rock. That was over. The truest punk lyric is Buzzcock 16, and I hate modern music, disco, boogie, and pop. It goes on and on and on and on. I wish it would stop. And that's how I certainly felt, because pop music wasn't doing its job of being exciting.
A lot of people liked both, didn't they? Well, disco especially. A lot of young people liked punk and disco, didn't they?
Yeah, but I was hardcore at that point. Yeah. To my detriment, I have to say. But the record that turned it round for me was I Feel Love, and Magic Fly by Space. Because suddenly you had the idea, along with Bowie, that you could have really interesting electronic music. And that was a huge change for me. And then much later, about 20 years later, I became one of my very good friends in New York, a man called Vince Aletti, who was the first person to ever coin the phrase disco, write about disco. And he said, "Right, John." And he sat me down with a little bit of stimulants and sat me down and gave me a disco education. And I loved it, so...
Wow. Okay, I'd like to pursue that road, but I think I need to gently pull the invisible cord back to 1967.
But I do think on that you do. It's an interesting thing getting older, because you do remember very keenly how you felt as a teenager. And difference when you're a teenager is as important as being part of the group. Certainly was for me. I wanted to be different from the group. I didn't want to be like everybody else, like the Kinks sang. And then, of course, as you get older, you realise it's sort of ludicrous. But there are certain things that I like to hold on to. For instance, I used to really hate the Jam. I don't now. I actually respect them. I re-examined my prejudice.
Why did you hate them at the time?
Because they were retro and I wanted new. And I saw them in early 77 and they were doing Heatwave in crappy Burton's two-tone shoes.
Okay.
Now, I listened to Down the Tube Station at midnight and I thought, that is a real tune. That's absolutely brilliant.
Yeah, and
An A-Bomb in Wardour Street, 2 great records. So total respect there.
And either one of the 2 or 3 greatest lyricists of his generation.
Well, not hard when you got Marquis Smith.
I don't even know how to begin to critically praise Marquis Smith.
I like being contentious, Peter. It's fun. It's pop music, you know.
Oh yeah, absolutely. I mean, I was, but you have to. I think you're right about honouring the truth as you saw it at that point in time. And before we go back to 1967, flip those 2 numbers around. 1976, I remember, and 77, I remember watching Top of the Pops. And when you have a thought in your head that you're too young to articulate it at the time, but what I was looking out for really subconsciously was sort of pop stars who, if my parents suddenly died,
yes,
what could they? What kind of a job would they do at looking after me? So Brotherhood of Man, obviously, and ABBA. I thought those and Kiki D. I thought they'd be good sort of substitute parents. So that was kind of the bedrock of my aesthetic at the time, and so I will always honour that. Yeah, that kind.
Yeah, but I'm sorry, I hate those records.
No.
But that's the difference, and that is a generational difference. And in 1976, I was very angry and very frustrated. And also, I was a young gay man, and being gay then was absolutely dreadful thing to be.
How old were you in 1967?
I was 13, turning 14.
And did you know you were gay at that point?
Not overtly, no. I think shortly afterwards.
Okay.
Funnily enough, I was thinking about this yesterday, and I think maybe even that year the realisation hit. And of course it was a problem, even though, I'm doing a lot of work on the 50th anniversary of the SOA, 67 Sexual Offences Act, when homosexuality was partly decriminalised. And everybody thinks, wow, suddenly you had gay discos and everything. It was absolutely fabulous. It wasn't. It was still guilt-ridden and kind of depressing way into the 80s.
What were the records that I feel like the records that we really get obsessed with in our lives are sort of records that, even though we might not know it at the time, are kind of explaining our lives to us.
Either yes. I think it's very interesting. I love going back. For instance, doing the 66 book. I love going back to, because I love those records. And you don't quite know why you like them. And then it's interesting to put them in context of time and place. And what I got from 66, and in fact what I get from a lot of pop culture that period, it's about freedom. And that's certainly what I wanted. I wanted freedom from my parents' expectations. I wanted freedom from, the stupid prejudice against gay people. I wanted freedom to do what I want, which doesn't mean total license. It means self-discipline, as autonomy does. And that's what I wanted. And I heard freedom in those records. So, and going back to these, the records that I really liked at the time, I liked a lot of the kind of mainstreamish, want-to-be mainstreamish pop. So I really did like, Take Me in Your Arms and Love You was a huge hit, was a big hit. But I really loved I Can Hear the Grass Grow, which is one of the obvious ones, and Show Me, and Grooving, and Hand Don't Fit the Glove by Terry Reid, and Alternate Title, and the Piccadilly Line. So, about half of these I actually You Keep Running Away by the Four Tops, I actually loved at the time.
Terry Reid was a voice you could really get excited about, I imagine, just sort of immediately.
I don't know why I liked that record. I just did. There was a kind of drama to it, and I think he ad-libs very well at the end. That was a big favourite of mine, as was the Piccadilly Line at the third stroke. So it's kind of moody and spooky.
It's got that. I mean, it's such a brilliant idea for a song, and that sort of psychedelicization of the mundane everyday always works, doesn't it?
Well, it's Sergeant Pepper, basically.
Yeah, absolutely.
And yeah, that was a big. And Blossom Toes, Look at Me, I'm You, is about going to work in the morning and being completely miserable.
Yeah. It's interesting that one thing that really sort of took flight in 1967 is something that I think you kind of identify towards the end of 1966, the book, where you sort of talk about the sort of proliferation of vintage clothes, and this kind of looking back to kind of, Victoriana and old military kind of aesthetic, and it's sort of and it really took sort of full flight in a lot of records that came out in 1967.
Well, one of the most popular records in late 66 was Winchester Cathedral, and I went back and I was all prepared to hate it. And actually, I thought it was a well-made record. And this again goes back to what my prejudices. I thought that I really hated distant drum. At the time, I hated distant drums, and I hated Green Green Grass of Home. And I listened to both of them carefully. And while I wouldn't particularly want to listen to them very often, I thought they were very, very well-made records, and I can see why they were successful. And maybe if I was writing another history of 76, 77, maybe I don't think I would look at Brotherhood of Man. I think that's just too far. But I could probably look at Fernando and have it not annoy me, which it did intensely at the time. I don't know why. It's probably that stage in my life. But anyway, yes. I think... I don't know. I think it's... there's not an enormous amount of retro here. I mean, obviously, the whole Winchester Cathedral... I was Lord Kitchener's valet stuff kind of fed into Sergeant Pepper, which was the big event of the year. And obviously I couldn't get any Beatles records for this. You can't get Beatles or Stones, can you, Neil?
Can you get the Bee Gees?
The Bee Gees was another good example. I wouldn't have wanted... I think 1941 might have been... not 1941. New York mining disaster might have been on early... I do like the Bee Gees, on an early version of this. But let me see, are there any kind of super retro things? No, I think it's starting to play itself out, really, in 67.
Let me pick up on something you said earlier on about the sort of being able to see the good in something like the Green Green Grass of Home or whatever. And, understanding something is a real... When you start to understand something, it's a real impediment to sort of anger or sort of to intolerance, isn't it?
Yeah, but I like a bit of anger and intolerance when talking about music.
That's what I mean.
I mean, that's the problem. You've got to balance it. I mean, to me, that was work. It was work because I'm writing about the year and I have to make sense of the record, whether I like it or not. I don't have to make sense about these records because I'm just doing a compilation. So let me read you this chart, which was the exact chart probably that made me want to slash my wrists in April 1967 from the Record Mirror. Maybe not as dramatic as that, but there's nothing like being 13 and bored stupid. So number 1, Something Stupid by Frank and Nancy, no thanks. Number 2, Release Me by Engelbert, no thanks. Number 3, Puppet on a Spring Sandy Shore, ugh. Number 4, Little Bit Me, Little Bit You, not too bad, not their best, by the Monkees. This Is My Song by Harry Seacombe, no way. Ha Ha Said the Clown, yes, great pop record. Simon Smith, okay. I Was Kaiser Beale's Batman, no thanks. It's All Over by Cliff, no thanks. And Edelweiss by Vince Hill, not a great chart.
No.
Compared to the previous year. And of course, what happens is that there's a brief hiatus in British pop music. You start to have the division between, which you didn't have in the high 60s, between mums and dads records, mainstream pop, and the nascent underground. And part of the problem is the pirate radio stations, which are beginning to disappear, and the pirate radio stations informed, if you like, the holistic nature of mid-60s British pop culture, because you'd hear all these records jumbled together. And then at this stage, you didn't have Radio 1 yet. A lot of the pirates were going down. There was still Radio London, still Radio Caroline South, but some of them were already being shut down at the end of 66. And also you have the gigantic hole left in British pop culture by the disappearance of the Beatles. until, in fact, March or February, in fact, when they released Penny Lane. And mums and dads had always bought records, obviously, because even in the high 60s, you had The Bachelors and Ken Dodd Tears. And, I mean, again, people say, well, come on, John, they were good records. And I'm saying, no, I'm not having it. Because at the time, till I started hearing the Parrots, the only pop input I got was on BBC Light Programme, or Top of the Pops, or Ready Steady Go. And I was an avid watcher of Ready Steady Go and Top of the Pops. And so you had to get through 3 dreadful records to get to the record you liked. And so the record you liked, you had to sit through the Seekers and, I don't know, whoever, Ken Dodd, before you got to the Yardbirds. And I wanted the Yardbirds. I didn't want the Seekers.
And was this the stuff that your parents liked?
No, they didn't particularly like it at all.
Were they just not interested?
They weren't. They were basically uninterested in music at all. My father liked a bit of light orchestral. He liked Mantovani and Bert Camford. And they indulged me in my love of the Beatles, but they did not indulge me in my love of the Stones.
Was it a worry to them?
No. It wasn't a worry to them until a bit later when I started misbehaving.
Okay.
I mean, I was a good boy at this stage. I got a scholarship and all that stuff. So.
When did you start? How did your misbehaviour manifest itself?
Long hair and drugs, and then when I went to university, it was long hair, drugs, radical politics, homosexuality. I was trying to tick all the boxes, basically.
Would you, quite sort of defiantly?
Methodically.
Did this all happen in quite a short space of time?
No, because I started taking drugs when I was 18. But yeah, I didn't want that middle class life. And, I now understand my parents' middle class life, which was very much to do with living through the war. Yeah. My mother was too young to fight, obviously, but the experience of the war was terrible. And so the idea was to settle down, everything's going to be peaceful and nice, which I totally understand. But of course, it's my generation's task as opposed to yours because I'm probably 10 years older than you, 12 years older.
I'm 47.
Each generation has its own time and its own task. Our task, in part, was to deal with all the stuff that our parents repressed about the war and all the stuff that they had repressed about their own natures and their own family. The stiff upper lip, everything was tamped down. And I'm still finding out stuff about my family that I never knew.
Such as?
My father I've only recently found out about my paternal grandparents, both of whom died, and my great-great-grandfather, because my father was born in Ireland. Thank you, Dad. Which means that I've been applying for an Irish passport.
I've been applying for a separate one, funnily enough.
Which means, sod you, Brexiteers. And so I've had to go back into all that, and it's fascinating, yeah.
Yeah, I would imagine it's sort of over the years, because they're such... They tend to do quite well. Autobiographical books tend to do quite well. And one very conspicuous thing about... I mean, I think you described 1966 as a sort of... secret, or no? Was it? Did you describe it as a secret autobiography, or sort of an autobiography by proxy? But you're not in it as such.
No, I find unless you're doing I have to say, when I read histories, I want to read the history. I don't want to read the history plus the author's journey. The author's journey is part. A lot of the work you do on the book, as you well know, is foundations. Foundations might get quite high, but they get lopped off when the proper building is erected and you don't see them. That's all stuff that you don't want the reader to see. I'm sorry. I'm very, very strong about this. I'm also not particularly excited by a lot of the kind of pop autobiographies. I'm interested in pop music because I'm interested in the extraordinary. I'm interested in the present and the future. I'm interested in the present and the future in the past. I'm also, when I look at the past, trying to make it relevant today, but also to work out what was at stake. People have this image of 67 as the year of flower power. It wasn't. That was part of it, but it wasn't all peace and love, to be sure. And the same with 66. And so if you put music in context of time and place, which is quite a hard job of research, and project yourself back into how people were thinking and feeling, then that begins to be proper history. It's not all about you.
Yeah.
There's so much that I'm afraid I find incredibly narcissistic and incredibly tedious. For instance, a very good example is when I'm doing a teenage book, history of youth culture book. I faced this very directly because I had to deal with the Hitler Youth. Now, obviously, what you'd expect to say, the bunch of horrible little Nazis. Well, they were a bunch of horrible little Nazis, but that's not good enough. What did they think they were doing? What did they feel that made them act this way?
Yeah.
What were the pressures? So that's what you have to. So in other words, you have to take it out of yourself. And I got very tired with the whole Hornby and sub-Nick Hornby kind of writing about music, where it was all about personal response. There's no reason why you can't do proper analysis and proper research into this topic, because it's a fascinating topic. And it's the people who made the records were taking what they did seriously. It's not all a bloody joke. It's not all about you. People, for some of these people and for some of the fans involved, it was life or death.
Is there not middle ground, though? Is there? Research is, I absolutely agree. This is why, the chart you were quoting earlier on is one from a music paper 50 years ago I brought along.
Oh, I love these.
So do I, and because they tell the real story, and
yes.
No one is going to tell you what a completely constant presence Dave D, Dozy Beaky, Mick and Titcher in the top 10, unless you actually go through these things, and they're in every bloody week. It's you can only really get a sense of a thing if you kind of project yourself back to the present tense as it was then.
Yes.
And that completely comes through in your music writing. But I feel like there can be a middle ground. I feel like you can sort of do both. And you must have had interest from people saying, okay, you've given us this and you've given us this, but where do you sort of...
in the end, I'm not important. The work is important. I don't have that kind of ego. I just don't. To me, the whole point is the work. And the work is how I interpret the work, really. And how I interpret the work is, I always was like that. When I started, I think it might go back to when I was writing for the music press, the one person I did not want to be when I started as a music writer for Sounds in April 77, I was going to be the anti-Nick Kent. Okay, because I didn't want to project myself into the story and pretend to be mates with all the groups and do all that stuff. I couldn't be asked. As far as I'm concerned, I had a job to do, and the job was to try and put over what the group was doing, to try and get intelligent quotes out of them so that it actually made them look reasonably good and made for an interesting read. And also, if you're a music journalist, you're an interface, which I loved being, and I still love writing about music. A lot of people who were music journalists get very snobby and tell, I don't want to write about that anymore. It's just, I want to be a political journalist or whatever. But I love writing about music, and I have no problems with it at all. You are the interface, really, and it's a valuable job. And I always get irritated with musicians who go, "No, you're a journalist." And it's like, yeah, well, we're actually working on your behalf a lot of the time, thanks very much. And we're actually taking all the ums and ers and ahs out of the quotes and actually making you look good and trying to get over in words what you do in music. Thank you very much. It's actually a good symbiosis if you're not being asked about it.
Absolutely. The converse of this is, we sort of often... Our friend Bob Stanley is an honourable exception, but often when music journalists try and make records, they're sort of terrible because they're so conversant with the theory, the do's and don'ts, the kind of the aesthetic sort of rules, that they just can't switch off enough to make a record that's really exciting. Whereas there's just that's something we will always be envious of musicians about.
I'm not envious because you have to I just realise there are people that can do what I can't do, and I always love music, and I actually like musicians, and I'm not envious of them at all. I never wanted to be a pop star, and I never had a group.
You can like them and be envious of them at the same time.
Oh, no, I'm not envious. I'm absolutely not. I like being a writer. That's what I always wanted to do.
Let's talk about a couple of... a few more of these tracks on some wonderful choices, and one of them being Behemoth by the Shadows of the Night, which is an astonishing record. And later I realised features Hawk Walensky, who went on to write Street Player which was covered by Chicago, and Ain't Nobody. Did you know that?
I did not know that. That's very good research, Peter.
Sorry, I don't.
No. It's. I mean, it's fascinating, all that stuff. In one of the Pied Piper, which we might be featuring on the 65 comp, which I'm doing for Ace next. We're going back in time. Was part written by Artie Kornfeld, and it was recorded by a group called the Changing Times. It's a good jangler, of Postbird's jangler. It was very heavily featured in a notorious teenage murder case in Tucson, Arizona, with somebody called Schmidt, which Andy Warhol was obsessed by. And Artie Kornfeld, who was a co-writer, went on to be one of the promoters of Woodstock.
Wow.
So I love all these.
Yeah.
I love all these
Me too.
connections.
Me too. It's just a bit of kind of idle sort of, Googling, just to sort of throw yourself open to happenstance can yield so much, because, of course, these people don't go away unless they drop dead very suddenly. But,
and also it's like the sort of, it's like the, how many degrees of separation is it? Is it 1 degree? Six degrees of separation, yeah.
I loved Try It by The Attack as well. That felt to me, I just loved, I guess I liked the optimism of that track.
Yeah, and also he's very louche. It's a very cynical, sneery London. It's sort of semi-punk in a way. And the Standells did it, and it's much more straightforward. And I really like The Attack, because the lead singer was only sort of 17 or 18. He's trying desperately to be like Mick Jagger, and it's just almost hilarious, which I do like a bit of ludicrousness in pop music.
Try It is also the title of, I'm sure it's a song you almost certainly know, the title of my favourite song from the Hollies album, Butterfly, that came out that year, which is, so many great albums came out. And this is something I wanted to touch on, because it kind of blows my mind how many sort of, the artists we regard as canonical now all had albums out in 1967. I mean, it's just so much happened. You've got to, obviously the Beatles, but the Monkees put out Headquarters, the Bee Gees first, and Are You Experienced, and Wild Honey, and between
Smiley Smile, which is great.
Yes. Piper at the Gates of Dawn, The Who Sell Out, Something Else was 67, was it? I think.
Yes, Kinks. Yes.
Yeah, and Younger Than Yesterday. I mean, it genuinely does rather feel like there was something in the water.
Well, I think also this is the money feeding through into the pop industry. And people, and also in 66 you do get the album, quite a lot of albums that are more than just a couple of singles and filler. So you get Love, you get Blonde on Blonde, you get Pet Sounds, obviously. And Pet Sounds is weird, actually. Sometimes I listen to it and I can't stand it, and then other times I listen to it and I think it's absolutely brilliant. You have to be in the mood. You have to be in the mood for it.
Yeah, I totally agree. Actually.
Sometimes it just feels a little bit too kind of faux innocent, and then other times you just think it's absolutely sublime. I mean, but Heroes and Villains, which isn't on this, is probably my favourite Beach Boys single. I just love it to bits, because it just reminds me of having a transistor and lying on the South Downs in the sun in summer 67 and listening to that record. So, there's a lot of memory in it, and there is a lot of disguised autobiography, but I think autobiography is best, and I know I'm running against the trends here, when it is tamped down, if not disguised, then, put in a cage and just put to one side. Obviously, it was very interesting when I did the intro to 66. The intro is about 25 paragraphs long, and in the very last paragraph I said, well, I was 12, 13 in 66, and that's what everybody focused on, because people want this autobiographical stuff in music writing, and I feel very strongly that unless it is reined in, most of the time it makes for not very good and very interesting writing, because it's a substitute for research, for going back to primary sources like these pop things, which are absolutely fantastic. I spent my 2 years or 3 years doing 66 bathed in rave and Record Mirror and disc, and I can tell you it's a very nice place to be.
I don't do the same.
In this Record Mirror, for instance, you got Tony Hall Tony Hall's column, which is he was one of the best writers about pop music in '66 and '67, and he's forgotten. Everybody goes on about Rolling Stone, or everybody goes on about the NME, the great days of the NME.
Why are these people forgotten? Because, in terms of evoking the excitement of the period, I agree, and Penny Valentine as well.
Penny Valentine's brilliant, because people are lazy. And, I've always resented the stranglehold that the NME has in any ideas about pop press, because I never worked for the NME. I worked for Sounds and I worked for Melody Maker.
Well, also, going back to this period, Record Mirror and Disc, if you want, because they were not...
streets ahead of this.
They were not snobby, and also Colour is brilliant, obviously. Those kind of gossipy tidbits sections where you just have these little kind of bullet point sound bites about, what car a member of Manfred Mann had towed away from Piccadilly that last night or whatever.
No, it's great. I mean, it's pop.
That's pop.
It's pop. It's pop. It's what we all want. It's pop. And that's what I grew up with, really. And I regard all these records, really, as pop or potential pop. That's the whole idea. They're all singles, so most of them are upbeat. Because music was still really made for dancing then. I mean, all of these would have been, the idea would be you would dance to them. And it was still, I mean, to me, the experience was hearing Buffalo Springfield along with Joe Tex, and there being no... That's why I got really irritated later on when there's all this snobbery about soul, or snobbery about rock, for that matter, because I never regarded the two as really separate, and I always loved Motown to bits from the word go. So I always had, I've always liked a very, very wide range of music.
That will always be I feel like that will always be to the Beatles' credit that they were just so early on Motown.
Yes.
That they completely got the kind of importance of this music. Yeah,
I mean, I was trying to think about this. The first black American I must have been aware of must have been Little Eva, Locomotion. And that was 62. And then, because shortly after that, she made a record with Big D. Irwin that was a huge hit in the UK, and that was Swinging on a Star. Don't know whether you know that one.
No,
it's great. Swing on a Star, Big D. Irwin, and Little Eva. And then, of course, shortly after that, you had Where Did Our Love Go? And then that was it. Supremes were a fairly constant fixture. Not totally, but a fairly constant fixture. And certainly by 66, when I was listening to Pirate Radio, you heard a lot of Motown. I loved Uptight and records like that.
I'm fascinated by another really interesting thing about this precise period in history covered by the compilation is that it's this kind of sense that over on one side you had the really important, meaningful rock stuff, and then on the other side you had the kind of light, fluffy stuff. Another reason I like reading these magazines is that you see, after closing time, all the kind of serious, respected, meaningful musicians and all the light entertainment people were off at places like the Bag of Nails.
Yes.
They all had that mutual respect for each other as entertainers. They're all part of entertainment.
Yes. Well, I think yes, and also a lot of what you're talking about was erected subsequently, and you're talking about the canon really of rock journalism. And of course, the canon of rock journalism, probably to someone of your age, must seem very irritating. I grew up with it, so I understand why it happened. And what I feel about that is, of course, it left out loads of things, but also it's not necessarily wrong either. And there was an awful lot of pomposity about rock music. And I think that's understandable. It can be a bit irritating, but I mean, nobody cares about that now. It's all gone.
Nobody cares about which aspect specifically.
The pomposity, people's pomposity about music, it's all gone.
Yes.
And a better thing for it, And it is interesting. I do think one has to be. I mean, I like hanging on to my teenage prejudices, but I do think one basically has to be fairly relaxed about these things. And I only get into them when I want to get into a sort of free and frank discussion about what's crap and what isn't, which is always fun. You read a lot of this stuff. You read Disc, and it's Mick Jagger slagging off Scott Walker on Scott Walker slagging off Mick Jagger because he's flung a cigarette into his drink. And I think, oh, yeah, that's great. That's what pop music is about as well. Everybody's slagging each other off.
What I really love about this whole era is that you can pick up pretty much any of these magazines and, you know, Scott Walker will be in there moaning about something. Yeah, always.
I do love the story, and I don't know whether it's true, that Andrew Logan said, and I do love the Andrew Loog Oldham book, Stone 1 and Stone 2, his autobiography, and because they're fascinating on so many levels. And he tells the story of going around with Mick one day and banging on Scott's door and saying, "Come on out, you old queen. Stop being a misery." Which is not perhaps the best way to deal with the topic, but it was certainly very funny.
But it's also like... As well as obviously Scott Walker complaining, you also got loads of letters complaining about Scott Walker complaining, which would seem to be really pissing a lot of people off just all over Britain.
Well, their reign didn't last very long, actually, when you look at it. At the top, they had about 3 or 4 top 5s, and then that was it. It was all 17s and 20s. I actually liked the Walker Brothers. They were, I mean, I was still 12, 13, I was still liking mainstream pop then. And I liked early Dave D. I did like Hold Tight, and Bend It was hilarious. Dave D did go a bit crap in '67. Zabadak was not one of their best. On the other hand, Zabadak has got this insane wannabe psychedelic flip called The Sun Goes Down, which I don't know whether you know, but it's hilarious.
No, it sounds great. I mean, look, to be honest, I love The Legend of Xanadu. So,
yeah,
you know, okay. I mean, I'm completely all that stuff cheers me up.
Well, yes, and then there is a point to pop music with that. I think probably by this stage, I was getting into I was very into West Coast when I was 13, 14, 15, and so I was probably veering into that. I was just beginning to separate myself. And I think what's interesting about identity in pop music is that by the age of, certainly the age of 16, I was interested in not being part of the peer group, which I had been, but in being separate from the peer group. So there was a wonderful occasion when we had a competition. I must have been 16, 17. And what's the heaviest record? Okay, so it must have been 1970. What's the heaviest record? So we sat, we stood around, got by the record player. Deep Purple in rock, Black Sabbath, all that fucking crap. And then I put on Sister Ray. And I cleared the room.
Oh, well.
I cleared the room. Then I had to listen to the bloody thing for 15 minutes by myself. And at that stage, it's only actually 10 or 15 years later that I really started to enjoy it. I like the short songs, but there's nothing like punishing yourself. But anyway, yeah, the Velvets cleared the room.
You won, you know.
I absolutely shut them down. But I did like the Velvets very early on. So I was seeking something different. I was seeking something different from a very early age. And I think that is also having been exposed, really, and this is an accident of birth. I was 9 when I first heard the Beatles, and I was just there from then. I mean, and my first pop love was Del Shannon, and when I was 8 and 9, and that was 62. And then it was the Beatles, and then that was it, you know. I was glued.
From the get-go, from like Love Me Do?
No, because I was sent away to a boarding school for a year, and which I ran away from. And the first one I heard was From Me to You.
Okay, I have to ask you what the circumstances of you running away were.
Oh, I couldn't stand it. It was a horrible place.
But did you literally just flee? Did you get on the train?
Yeah, I just walked out the front door.
Where was the boarding? Where was it?
It was in Seaford. And you're supposed to go up a former term, and a former year, and I went up a former term. So I was a 9-year-old in a form of 11-year-old. So you can imagine. And I was bullied, and I just wasn't going to stand it. Bullying is one of my trigger points. Yeah. If anybody tries to bully me, I just go mental, which is why I don't like Brexit, because it's all about bullying. And it was the winter of 62, 63, the worst winter in the second half of the 20th century.
That was the fog and the snow, wasn't it?
It was the snow, and I thought I could walk home, but I realised that I couldn't, so I turned myself in.
To what? Did you just try?
I walked back.
Oh, right, okay.
But I'd made my point. My parents took me away from this bloody place.
Well, but good for you.
It's direct. It's called direct action, Pete.
Absolutely.
Anyway, so From Me to You was the first Beatles record, and then I was glued to Ready Steady Go from summer '63, and then Top of the Pops when it started. So I saw the whole thing as a preteen, really.
And in Ealing, where you could actually just get on the Central Line, presumably, and just go straight to the heart of the action.
Yes, I was too young to do that. And also I was under quite strict parental control, which one wasn't as a 50s child. But Ealing, of course, was a pop environment because there was the Ealing Club and also the R&B Club, in fact, where the Stones had played. And it felt very mod. I remember Ealing feeling very mod. And there was a local group called the Eyes, who had a huge poster on Ealing Broadway Station. I used to get the Underground to school every day, and from Acton Town to Ealing Broadway, and had a huge poster. And they had a sort of pseudo Who record. They were actually they're now called Freak Beat, and it was sort of quite good in a slightly annoying way. In fact, they were very good in a slightly annoying way. And they all had rugby shirts, and then in the middle of the rugby shirt was an eye. You know, and these are the sort of records that now go for sort of £400, £500. I'm sure Bob's got them.
I'm not surprised. He's got some of them. I've got. I always thought that Acton Town was the most mod place of all because from a distance it looked like it said Action Town.
Oh, okay. Well, we've got the action on here.
Indeed.
They missed a trick there. They could have done a promo picture there with an eye.
Phil Collins' favourite band of all time. Do you know that?
No, but it doesn't bother me.
Even this made me warm to Phil Collins. He even, when they reformed in 2002, I think, he even joined them for that tour, which I thought was rather sweet. And final question, John, if you could only listen to one song from 1967, again, if you're only allowed to listen to one song from this compilation in perpetuity, again, which one would you choose?
That's a good question. Let me have a look. It would be I think the one, it's not necessarily my favourite from the time, but you'd want something that is elusive, that retains the interest because you don't quite know what it is. And I would choose Tintin Abbey Vacuum Cleaner because it's a sort of perfect psychedelic record, and it's very elusive. You don't know quite what it's about, and it's very dreamy. And I like dreamy records.
Okay, you've really thought about this very practically, which I just would have gone for my favourite, which so now I feel like a bit of a simpleton. But
no, but I've got loads of favourites. I mean, I do actually really like them all, and so that's what makes it hard. And that's what's great about doing comps, because you get to be a fan, and if you like, a curator, but a fan, and rather than a critic. And I now am not a critic. I was a pop critic when I was younger, and that inevitably means that sometimes you write horrible things about people, and you get involved in all the feuds you get involved in the music press. And it's nice, really, just to be able to get away from all that and just say, we all got into this because we love pop music. Here's some tunes I really like. Hope you like them too. It's as basic as that.
Yeah, I know what you mean. I don't have the heart to sort of slag things off as much anymore.
I love a good slag off.
Well,
yes.
I know you do. I know you do, but I don't want to be doing it myself. But unless it's something something Brexit related, maybe.
No, but I mean, but I love it, but I don't do it.
But like a younger, why? And I'm not sure if it's a good look for someone in their late 40s to sort of really tear into a bunch of kids who sort of.
Not now. I mean, I slagged stuff off when I was on the music.
That's what I mean. I think you're naturally iconoclastic. As a teenager and someone in their 20s, it's an iconoclastic time of life. So I'm just not sure if there's a way to do it sort of later on in life. For what it's worth, I think I'd probably go for Sharon Tandy. Hold on.
That's a pretty terrific record, actually. I was listening to that the other day, and in the car and dancing around in the car. It's pretty good.
It's kind of the most. I think it's kind of the most depraved thing on there in a way. It makes you want to sort of do things that are completely out of character.
Well, that, of course, was always a function of rock music. And I always remember once I travelled up to Manchester to do an event with Tony Wilson and Paul Morley and Stuart Cosgrove, and it was a television show. We were all appearing on it, and I had one tape. I drove up the M6, and I had one tape in the car, and I got involved in a huge accident, so I was late. And the tape I wasn't involved in the aftermath of a huge accident, so I was really late, and I was really, really pissed off. And the only tape I had in the car was a C90. One side was the Stooges, and the other side was Raw Power. And that day, I was ready to kill. And I did. I said unforgivable things to everybody. But that's because the Stooges are a classic example of a group that make you want to do bad things.
Yeah.
And that was always a function of rock music in particular, was the id function. Okay, that we can all be terribly reasonable and terribly nice, but there's a little nasty little bit of us that just wants to drive at 120 miles an hour, take Class A's, have rampant sex with whoever and whatever, and that's always a place for rock music. And maybe a little bit of that. That's what Sharon Tandy suggests, because it is pretty raunchy.
And that, dear listener, was where we left it. No one quite says the word raunchy like Jon Savage does. My thanks to Jon for keeping me in most excellent company for the last hour. Thanks to you for listening. This has been the Ace Records podcast. I'm Pete Paphides, and I hope you can join me next time. For more excellent music, you can scoot over to the Ace Records website, www.acerecords.co.uk, for all the wonderful music you could possibly need.